Europe was on fire, and at the center of it stood one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who had bent nations to his will. For years, his armies moved like a storm across the continent, crushing kings, redrawing borders, and rewriting history with every victory. But now, the storm was turning against him. From every direction, enemies closed in. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia. United not by loyalty, but by fear of one man. They had lost to him before. They would not lose again. France was exhausted. Its soldiers were no longer the unstoppable force they once were. Supplies were fading. Morale was cracking. And yet, Napoleon kept fighting, because that's all he knew. He launched one last desperate campaign, striking fast, striking hard, trying to break the coalition before it could fully close around him. For a moment, it almost worked. For a moment, the legend flickered back to life. But this time, it wasn't enough. The numbers were too great, the pressure too heavy, and slowly, the empire he built began to collapse. Paris fell. The capital that once celebrated him now stood silent under enemy control. No cheers, no glory, just the quiet acceptance of defeat. And then, the unthinkable happened. Napoleon surrendered. The man who had once ruled Europe laid down his power, but his enemies didn't kill him. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, they chose something far worse. They exiled him, not to a distant continent, not to a prison cell, but to a small island in the Mediterranean, Elba, a place so small it could barely hold his shadow. When Napoleon arrived, he was no longer an emperor, no grand army, no throne, just a handful of loyal followers, and the ruins of everything he had built. The world believed it was over, that the legend had ended, that Napoleon Bonaparte was finished. But they misunderstood one thing. You don't erase a man like Napoleon by taking away his crown, because even in exile, even in silence, he was still watching, still thinking, still waiting, standing on the shores of Elba, staring out across the endless sea. He wasn't seeing defeat. He was seeing a path, and somewhere beyond that horizon, his empire was still there, waiting to be taken back. Elba was supposed to be a prison, but Napoleon didn't see it that way. He saw it as a pause, a temporary silence before the storm returned. The island was small, quiet, almost forgettable. But Napoleon was not a man who could fade into silence. Even in exile, he acted like a ruler. He inspected roads, gave orders, rebuilt small systems, but none of it mattered. Because his mind was somewhere else, across the sea, in France. And what he heard changed everything. The new king, Louis XVIII, was losing control. The people were unhappy. The army was restless. The same soldiers who once followed Napoleon were now serving a crown they didn't respect. France wasn't stable. France was waiting, and Napoleon knew it. Every day, he walked along the shore, watching ships pass by, calculating, thinking, planning. Yet his enemies believed he was finished. They stopped paying attention. Guards relaxed, surveillance weakened. That was their mistake. Because Napoleon had already made his decision. He wouldn't die on this island. He would return, quietly, carefully. He began to prepare. Loyal men were chosen. Ships were secured. Timing was everything. If he failed, there would be no second chance. This wasn't just an escape. This was a gamble against all of Europe. On the night of February 26, 1815, the silence of Elba broke. Under the cover of darkness, Napoleon and around 1,000 men boarded small ships. No grand fleet, no massive army, just a handful of soldiers, and a leader who refused to accept defeat. The sea was unpredictable. One wrong move, and everything would end before it even began. If the British Navy spotted them, it was over. But luck, or destiny, was on his side. They slipped through. No alarms, no interception, no resistance, just open water and a path back to France. As the island of Elba disappeared into the distance, Napoleon stood still, looking ahead. He wasn't running away. He was going back to take everything. Behind him, exile. Ahead of him, an entire kingdom that thought he was gone forever. And soon, they would realize. The emperor was not finished. The ships touched the French coast, and just like that, the impossible had begun. Napoleon stepped onto the land he once ruled, not as an emperor, not as a conqueror, but as a man with everything to lose. No grand army waited for him. No cities opened their gates, just silence, and 1,000 men behind him. Ahead, an entire kingdom ready to crush him. News spread fast. Napoleon has returned. At first, it sounded like a rumor, then a mistake, then a nightmare. King Louis XVIII panicked. Orders were sent immediately. Stop him. Armies were deployed. Soldiers marched out to intercept him before he could reach Paris. The plan was simple. Surround him. End it quickly. Erase him before he could rise again. Napoleon knew this would happen. He wasn't surprised. He was waiting for it. As he marched north, step by step, village by village, something strange began to happen. People didn't run. They watched. Some even followed. Because this wasn't just a man returning. This was a legend walking back into history. Then came the moment that could have ended everything. Near Grenoble, royal troops stood in his path, guns ready, orders clear. If Napoleon moved forward, they would fire. This was it, one command, and it was over. No empire, no comeback, no history, just a failed escape. Napoleon didn't stop. He walked forward, alone. No weapon in his hand, no fear in his eyes, just silence. He stood in front of the soldiers, close enough to be killed in seconds. And then he did something no one expected. He opened his coat. And said, "If any one of you will kill his emperor, here I am." For a moment, nothing moved. No shots, no commands, just tension hanging in the air. And then, everything changed. One soldier lowered his weapon, then another, and suddenly, "Vive l'Empereur!" The same army sent to stop him joined him. In that moment, Napoleon didn't just survive. He took back control, without a battle, without a fight. As he continued his march toward Paris, his army grew stronger with every step. Regiment after regiment abandoned the king and returned to the man they once followed into fire. By the time he reached the capital, there was no one left to stop him. King Louis XVIII fled. No resistance, no final stand, just fear and silence. Napoleon walked into Paris, not as an exile, but as an emperor once again. The impossible had happened. In just weeks, a man with nothing had taken back an entire empire. But this time, the world was watching, and Europe was already preparing for war. Napoleon was back, but the world he returned to was no longer the same. For a brief moment, Paris felt alive again, as if history had reversed itself and the empire had been reborn. Crowds gathered, soldiers cheered, and the name Napoleon once again echoed through the streets with power. But beneath that energy, there was fear, because everyone knew this was not a victory. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Across Europe, the reaction was immediate. The same nations that had once united to destroy him did not hesitate this time. There were no negotiations, no warnings, no second chances. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia declared him an enemy once again. To them, Napoleon wasn't a ruler. He was a threat that had escaped, and now he had to be ended permanently. Napoleon understood this better than anyone. What he knew they were coming. He knew that this return had started a war he might not survive. But instead of slowing down, he moved faster. He began rebuilding his army, calling back veterans, preparing weapons, reorganizing command. Every second mattered now. This wasn't about ruling anymore. This was about survival. For 100 days, the empire stood again. Not in peace, but in tension. Every decision carried weight. Every movement felt like it was being watched. It was as if all of Europe was holding its breath, waiting for the moment everything would explode. And that moment was coming. Because beyond the borders of France, armies were gathering. Massive, unstoppable forces, marching with one purpose: to crush Napoleon once and for all. But the storm that once followed him into battle was now turning against him from every direction. This was no longer a comeback story. This was the final chapter. Napoleon had returned from exile, shocked the world, taken back his throne without a single decisive battle. But now, the real war was about to begin. A war that would decide not just his fate, but the future of Europe itself. And soon, on a field that would be remembered forever, everything would end.